I want to put the so-called God wars in some kind of historical and political perspective. And in so doing, I'll be picking up some of the themes that Sven was talking about, the relationship between secularization of religion, if you like, and the sacralization of the secular, the relationship between contemporary forms of religion and traditional forms of religion, the relationship between religion and religiosity, and so on. And I want to start with one of the images that Sven put up, which was that one of Time magazine, Is God Death, one of Time's most famous covers. And it was a feature on the so-called death of God theologians, which were a strong force in the 1960s, who were despairing of ever reviving God, were attempting to rework scripture for a rewrite the Bible for a godless age. 40 years later, of course, now, the idea of the death of God seems maybe as believable as the story of resurrection itself. So in America, more than 50% of the population apparently believe in the literal word of Genesis. And while the Lord guides presidential policy, at least till next week, on everything from stem cells to Iraq. In India, the Hindu fundamentalist party, the BJP, has been in power, well, was in power, for a number of years. In Iraq, a once secular nation, is now torn apart by sectarian religious conflict. In China, the former Soviet Union, the gods that failed have been replaced by more ancient deities. And of course, the spectre that truly haunts our age is that of radical Islam, of 9/11 and 7/7, Madrid and Bali and so on. And God's calling cards in that sense seem to be everywhere. They're all too easy to see and terrifying to witness. And in this age of the worldwide jihad and the march of the creationists, only the blind and the mad, it would seem, would deny the return of religion. Now, I don't think I'm blind, I hope I'm not mad, but I do want to suggest that the return of religion is as illusory as was the death of God in the first place. God is no more alive today than he was dead then. Rather, the very meaning of religion has changed. For the embrace of contemporary religion has actually little to do with God, and still less to do with theology, but is bound up with secular ideas of identity. And that's part of the issue I want to deal with this afternoon. The argument for the return of religion is ironically tied very closely to the argument for the death of God. In his book, The Twilight of Atheism, the theologian, the British theologian, Alistair McGrath, links the revival of religion to what he calls the remarkable rise and subsequent fall of atheism. The rise and fall of atheism, he suggests, was framed by two pivotal events: the fall of the Bastille in 1789 and that of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And in between the Bastille and the Berlin Wall lay what McGrath calls the golden age of atheism. In fact, the golden age of atheism is a convenient fiction for both sides of the God wars. For atheists, it demonstrates the possibility of a godless world and the backwardness of contemporary faith. For believers, it shows how miraculous and necessary has been the return of religion. The trouble is, atheism never flourished as a significant social force, nor even begun to replace faith in any real sense. Even scientists, until well into the 20th century, were more likely to be believers than non-believers, and a significant proportion of scientists remain believers even today. What developed between the Bastille and the Berlin Wall was not atheism, but secularism. And to understand why the return of religion is not really the return of religion, we have to understand the changing character of secularism, it seems to me. The Canadian philosopher and Catholic Charles Taylor, in his book, A Secular Age, a book well worth reading to understand some of the changing character of secularism, observes that there are three meanings of secularism. The first is a separation of the public and private spheres of politics and religion. The second consists of the falling off of religious belief and practice. And the third is a transformation, what he calls a transformation of the conditions of belief. The shift to secularity in this sense consists of a move from a society in which belief in God is unchallenged and unproblematic to one in which it is understood as one option among many and not necessarily the most acceptable of options. And what I want to suggest is that in each of these senses, Western societies, and more generally societies, have over the past 2 decades become less secular without becoming more religious. It was and to do so, I wanted to take a kind of historical detour. It was in the 19th century that the so-called Great Separation took place, the uncoupling of politics and faith, the public and the private, an uncoupling that came to define modernity. Political ideology rather than religious dogma became the source of social conflict, war and revolution, class and social justice, race and national identity. These, rather than matters of faith, became the questions that divided Western societies over much of the past 2 centuries, much of those 200 years between the Bastille and the Berlin War. That great separation is often seen as evidence for the death of God. What I want to suggest is that it's both a lot more and a lot less than that. God did not die, but belief in a wider sense began to decay. And that, it seems to me, is the bigger problem we need to address. Consider the 3 19th century figures who, between them, embodied a changing attitude to religion: Darwin, Marx, and Nietzsche. Darwin provided, for the first time, a godless account of creation and made atheism not just conceivable, but potentially plausible. But Darwinism expressed much more than this. It also expressed a new relationship between science and religion. Traditionally, faith and religion had been seen not just as incompatible, but as inextricable. The concept of God as creating a lawful universe had played an important part in the development of science, and one of the reasons why many of the pioneers of the scientific revolution were deeply devout men. But in the 19th century, science developed a new identity. It became a professional discipline for a start, even though Darwin himself was the last of the old-fashioned gentleman natural philosophers. A discipline that was in many ways hostile to religion rather than embracing it. And it was one that was willing to tackle questions that traditionally were in the domain of theologians and philosophers. Questions like, what does it mean to be human? And how do we define good and evil? As Darwin himself wrote in his notebook in 1838, he who understands baboons will do more for metaphysics than Locke. If Darwin represented one aspect of what's come to be called the Enlightenment challenge to faith, the importance of reason over revelation, Marx represented another, the celebration of human agency. Religious distress, Marx wrote, is both an expression of real distress and a protest against real distress. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of the heartless world, and the soul of a soulless situation. It is the opium of the people. For Marx, religion was at one and the same time an expression of alienation and a comfort in the face of such alienation, a protest against oppression and a perpetuation of such oppression. For Marx, the real battle was not against religion, but against the social conditions which made religion both possible and necessary. The struggle against religion, he wrote, is a struggle against a world of which religion is a spiritual fragrance. Until the late 20th century, most atheists, liberal as well as Marxist, respected that argument, and their weapon of choice in promoting atheism was social transformation, not theological critique. It was only when social transformation appeared implausible that atheists turned their eye on theology itself and helped launch what we now call the God Wars. Darwin embodied the scientific assault on faith, Marx the political challenge. Both drew on the spirit of the Enlightenment, and both became highly influential. in determining attitudes to faith. But perhaps the biggest challenge to faith in the 19th century came not from a philosopher who carried a banner of enlightenment, but from one who was as dismissive of Enlightenment philosophers as he was of God, Nietzsche. No philosopher is more associated with the death of God, having coined the very phrase. But if Nietzsche was the high priest at God's funeral, he was also the chief celebrant at reason's wake. For the late 19th century experienced not simply a crisis of faith, but also what has come to be called the crisis of reason. The erosion of Enlightenment optimism, disenchantment with ideas of progress, and disbelief in concepts of truth. Nietzsche gave voice to a growing dissatisfaction of his age with both faith and reason, and his brilliance in doing so would eventually turn him into a key figure of the postmodern assault on the so-called Enlightenment project. It would ironically also make him indispensable to contemporary theology. The rise of postmodernity, Alistair McGrath, the theologian, observed with relish, has robbed atheism, and I quote, of its self-evident implausibility and appeal, and made appealing religions confession of modesty and despair. In other words, for theologians themselves, postmodernity is a useful attack on what they see as modernity and atheism, and Nietzsche plays an important part in that, surprisingly. The death of God, then, did not happen in isolation, but was part of a growing, broader estrangement from classical notions of truth, reason, and universal human values. Notions that were embodied both in traditional religion and the Enlightenment critique of faith. And this is why the Great Separation was both a lot more and a lot less than the death of God. God did not really die, but something more than God began to wither. If the 19th century saw the death of God, the 20th century might be characterised by the fall of man. As politics and religion were decoupled, religious belief became a private matter. So political theology based on God became replaced by a political philosophy centred on humanity. But secular political philosophy also required faith, though of a different kind. Faith that humans were capable of acting rationally and morally without guidance from beyond. That faith, too, has begun to be eaten away by the wider disenchantment with Enlightenment hopes and aspirations. The history of the 20th century, two world wars, the Depression, the Holocaust, Auschwitz and the Gulags, climate change and ethnic cleansing, helped further gnaw away at Enlightenment hope. And the fall of the Berlin Wall came to symbolise not just rejection of the tyranny of the Soviet Union, but also disenchantment with the very idea of human-directed transformation. Many had come to feel by 1989 that every impression that humanity made upon the world was for the worse. The attempt to master nature had led to global warming. The attempt to master society had led to Auschwitz and the Gulags. In a real sense, the late ecologist Murray Bookchin has suggested, we seem to be afraid of ourselves, of our uniquely human attributes. We seem to be suffering from a decline in human self-confidence and in our ability to create ethically meaningful lives that enrich humanity and the non-human world. And this sentiment of fear of ourselves, if you like, fear of humanity, fear of human attributes, was underpinned by a transformation in politics itself. The broad ideological divide that characterised politics in the previous 200 years have been all but erased. Politics has become less about competing visions of the kinds of society people want than a debate about how best to manage the existing political system. And as the meaning of politics has become squeezed, so people have come to view themselves and their social affiliations in a different way. Social solidarity has become increasingly defined, not in political terms as collective action in pursuit of certain political ideals, but in terms of ethnicity or culture. For an individual identity to be authentic, collective identity must be too. Just like individuals, Charles Taylor has written, a folk should be true to itself, that is, to its own culture. Now, this politics of identity developed in the 1960s through the growth of the new social movements, Third World Liberation movements, civil rights organisations, feminist groups, campaigns for grey rights and so on. But over the past 40 years, it's moved from a response of marginalised groups to inequality to being a key aspect of mainstream social policy. It now lies at the heart of much what we call multicultural policy. Vicky Perret, the political philosopher, the British political philosopher, summed up this argument, arguing that since the liberal is in theory committed to equal respect for persons, and since human beings are culturally embedded, so respect for people entails respect for their cultures and ways of life. And this demand that cultural differences be given public recognition and affirmation is in reality a demand for the reattachment of the public and the private. And that's the irony. The undoing of the 19th century Great Separation has been propelled not by pressure from resurgent religion, but through secular arguments about the nature of culture and the importance of cultural differences. And it is against this background, I think, that we need to talk about the return of religion. But religion itself has returned transformed by these changes, as Marx faded from the picture over the past 20, 30, 40 years. So Darwin's star, and that of Nietzsche, has shone ever brighter. Scientific, or rather scientistic explanations of the human condition, on the one hand, have great credibility, and on the other hand, postmodern cynicism has seeped into a wider culture. And both sides in the God Wars have been shaped by this. Take the question of religion. Religion comprises both a set of beliefs and a complex of social institutions, traditions and cultures that bind people in a special, particular relationship to a conception of the sacred. What is striking about contemporary forms of religion is that religious belief has been wrenched apart from religious institutions, traditions and cultures. Faith, as Charles Taylor observes, has become disembedded from its historical culture and reconstituted instead as part of the culture of expressive individualism, forms of spirituality grounded in the primacy of individual experience and rooted in the social values of what the writer Tom Wolfe has called the me generation. The sociologists Paul Heelis and Linda Woodward did a wonderful study of religious practices in a small town in northern England. And they've shown that while traditional religious congregations are on the decline, what they call New Age forms of spirituality are beginning to fill the gap. But more than this, many once traditional believers are now beginning to adopt New Age attitudes and rituals, developing new forms of faith that celebrate the emotional aspects of spirituality and seek to fulfill the believer's inner needs. And such congregations often combine a literal reading of the Holy Book and an insistence on the unchanging character of religious truth with a God that speaks to these individuals and their particular subjective needs. It's interesting contrasting the attitudes of traditional believers with the attitudes of these new believers. We don't go to Mass because we feel like it, or not go because we don't feel like it. We go because the church gave us an obligation to go to Mass, was how one elderly Roman Catholic lady explained why she went to church. And yet, interesting, if you look at the new forms of religion and whether you're talking about Christianity, charismatic Christianity or radical Islam, for all the literalism of these new faiths, such obligation is alien to them. Instead, so what these new faiths do is provide more space in which every individual participant can explore and express his or her emotions in his or her particular way, and let those emotions set the agenda of the religion rather than vice versa. A 1-hour service on a Sunday morning, one of Healers and Woodhead's New Age interviews snorted, it's not enough to explore your self-esteem, is it? The new religions are crafted to help people feel good rather than do good. They are fit for the age of Oprah. And such congregations of experiential difference, which are burgeoning, according to Healers and Woodhead, well, what they call traditional congregations of humanity, which feel a religious duty to serve a wider society, face a struggle for existence. And the growth of many contemporary forms of faith, whether radical Islam or the Pentecostal Church, marks not a return to traditional religion, but a break from it. A traditional Muslim will be as appalled by the rituals of radical Islam as that Catholic worshipper was by the New Ageism of charismatic Christianity. Religion, ironically, has become secularized, driven less by a search for piety and holiness than for identity and belongingness. Faith, in a sense, has been transformed into the religious wing of identity politics. Contemporary radical Islam, Nilofer Goller, who's a professor in Paris, suggests, is a religious experience of a new kind. It is not directly handed over by the community, religious or state institutions. Rather, it represents an affirmative reconstruction of identity. Consider, for example, the changing face of Islamic religious texts. For centuries, such works were written by religious scholars and had titles such as The Explanations of Secrets and The Pearls of Knowledge. Contemporary texts, Islamic texts, are without precedent in Islamic history because they're penned largely by lay people, and they address issues such as what does it mean to be Muslim and how to experience Islam. Questions that the answers to which would have been self-evident to previous generations of Muslims. Today, then, the answers are far from clear because Islam, like all religions, is being reinvented and redefined to meet secular, not religious needs. Islam today is constructed, reinterpreted, and carried into public life, Nilofer Goller writes, not through religious institutions, but through political agency and cultural movements. And this is true not just of Islam, but of all contemporary faiths. The new religions, whether radical Islam or Pentecostal Christianity, have more in common with each other than they do with conventional forms of faith. And they also have much more in common with some contemporary secular movements such as anti-globalization or environmentalism. And such secular movements, in turn, are often closer in outlook to the new faiths than they are to traditional progressive ideologies. As broader political, cultural and national identities have eroded, and as traditional social networks and institutions of authority and moral codes have weakened, so the resultant atomization of society has created both an intensely individual relationship to the world and a yearning for the restoration of strong identities and moral lines. And the new forms of faith address both these needs. They are strongest in those communities that have most felt the dislocatory effects of the erosion of politics: migrants to Europe, African Americans, and conservative white Americans who feel that the dominant liberal culture leaves them voiceless. The religious form most often regarded as a throwback to traditional faith, fundamentalism, signals, in fact, a breaking up, a tearing up of the past. It expresses a kind of anti-modern nihilism that is paradoxically a peculiarly modern sensibility, and is often also expressed through contemporary secular ideologies such as environmentalism or anti-globalization. Fundamentalists intensely hate liberal democratic values, but they're also hostile to traditional religious cultures. It is precisely the detachment of fundamentalism from traditional religious institutions and traditional religious cultures that forces its adherents to a literal reading of the Holy Book and to a strict observance of supposedly authentic religious norms. Without cultural or institutional embeddedness, fundamentalists look to the very word of the revealed text for anchorage, and to rigid social, cultural and moral forms, such as, for instance, the veil, to mark themselves out as distinct and provide a collective identity. Contemporary fundamentalism is very much a child of modern plural societies and a celebration of difference and authenticity. The illusion held by Islamic radicals, the French sociologist Olivier Roy writes, is that they represent tradition, when in fact they represent a negative form of westernization. And non-Islamic observers seems to me hold exactly the same illusion about Islam. Not only is contemporary fundamentalism a child of modern pluralism, it is also a child of modern scientific culture. Not because it is scientific, but it is a product of a culture in which science has become so important. A literal reading of the text only becomes possible and necessary in a culture that has accepted scientific notions of evidence. The book must tell the truth in a scientific, not allegorical or literary fashion as it used to do. Intelligent design, for instance, the new form of creationism, particularly in America, is a means of describing the Bible as providing not just revealed, but empirical truths. And that would not have been necessarily possible in a pre-scientific age. The Indian writer, Mirananda, has shown how Hindutva, the philosophy of the modern Hindu fundamentalist movement, marries a postmodern sensibility to a seeming acceptance of a scientific concept of empirical truth, to show that traditional Hinduism contains the seeds of, and I quote, a humane, ecological and non-reductionist science. What we're witnessing here, therefore, is not the return of religion in any traditional sense, but what Sven mentioned before, a return of religiosity. A sensibility to be found, not just in new forms of faith, it seems to me, but also, actually, in new forms of secular politics. And we can see that if we look at the other side of the God Wars. If contemporary faith is not a throwback to the past, but a new phenomenon, in many ways the same applies to atheism today. Contemporary atheists view themselves as forging, and I speak as an atheist myself, contemporary atheists view themselves as forging a new enlightenment. And certainly in an age in which the so-called Enlightenment project has fallen into disrepute, and in which reason is more often seen as a sin than as a virtue, the defence of Enlightenment virtues, Enlightenment values, has never been of greater importance. But the Enlightenment needs defending, not against its old foes, but against the contemporary assault on it. Unfortunately, though, new atheists often appear to be fighting the old battles of religion, not the new ones. There's a historical and political naivety about the new atheism that leads to ignore the complexities of religious faith. Atheists today often take as literal a view of faith as religious fundamentalists do themselves. Rather than delve beneath the surface and ask why it is that people increasingly take on religious identities, they take both the revealed text and the pronouncements of believers at face value. If the Bible is written by an omniscient being, the philosopher and neurologist Sam Harris is a key figure in the new atheist movement, particularly in America. If the Bible is written by an omniscient being, he asks in his book, The Letter to a Christian Nation, why does it not say anything about electricity, or about DNA, or about the actual age and size of the universe? What about a cure for cancer? This is the stuff not of a rational response to faith, but what I call of the village atheist. If New Wave atheists fail to understand that religion is not simply an unchanging old age belief written into revealed text, but also a response to the political complexities and social estrangements of the modern world, they equally fail to recognise that people today are as likely to turn to secularists as to religious belief to find consolation in the face of such estrangement, or that secularist belief can be as irrational and as misanthropic as any religious belief. Many themes traditionally associated with religion, a sense of fatalism, for instance, and of powerlessness in the face of cosmic forces, an embrace of eschatology, a view of the world in terms of good and evil, a belief in sin, and indeed in original sin, guilt as motivation for action, the expression of penitence, a fear of human hubris, a retreat from reason into the comforts of myths, and so on, have now become secularized and provided building blocks of non-religious and indeed of anti-religious ideologies. From environmentalism to cultural relativism, from scientific naturalism to radical critiques of science, many secular ideologies are far more influential than religion in spreading skepticism about reason and disenchantment about human activities. But in a sense, so bedazzled have contemporary atheists become by the threat of religion that they've blinded themselves to the irrationalism and indeed immorality of many secular ideologies. But what's interesting about the new atheism is that, like the new forms of faith, it itself is a response to the peculiarities of the 21st century. At the end of the 19th century, the English critic Matthew Arnold spoke in his stanzas from the Great Chartreuse about being caught, I quote, between two worlds, one dead, the other powerless to be born, with nowhere yet to rest my head. A century later, this sense of dislocation has become even stronger, the product of dissatisfaction not just with faith, but also with politics, and of scepticism about the possibilities of social transformation. Such scepticism has in turn changed perceptions not only of politics, but of science and of faith too. As faith in politics has drained away, so too has the political critique of faith, leaving simply a one-sided, politically naive scientific assault. Like faith, disbelief too has become disconnected from its social and political roots. And at the same time, science today is expected to provide not just a factual description of the world, but also a moral account of human existence. People need a sacred narrative, the American sociologist Theo Wilson, the founder of sociology, argues. They must have a larger sense of purpose in one form or another, however intellectualized. And such a sacred narrative, he suggests, can be either a religion or a science. The true evolutionary epic, he writes, retold as poetry, is as intrinsically ennobling as any religious epic. Evolutionary science has brought new revelations of great moral importance, from which new intimations of immortality can be drawn and a new mythos evolved. As politics has withered, so science has stepped in to answer questions that were previously seen as purely political. The writer and popularizer of evolutionary psychology, Robert Wright, he asks in his book, The Moral Animal, can a Darwinian understanding of human nature help people reach their goals in life? Indeed, can it help them choose their goals? Can it help distinguish between practical and impractical goals? More profoundly, can it help in deciding which goals are worthy? That is, does knowing how evolution has shaped our basic moral impulses help us decide which impulses we should consider as legitimate? And the answers, he says, are yes, 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 Yes and yes. In an age of uncertainty, then, when many people feel a sense of alienation from social institutions and from each other, both faith and science appear to provide people with a form of anchorage, giving them a sense of who they are, where they've come from, and where they're going to. The contemporary God wars, then, are not simply about whether or not God exists. They are also about how best to respond to the political, social, and moral dislocation of the post-Cold War period. In fact, God wars have never been a debate about the existence of God, but always been also a debate about the nature of being human. Religion attempts to give meaning and a dignity to our mundane existence through creating a relationship between the profane and the sacred. But in doing so, the sacred becomes a means of diminishing the sense of what it is to be human. Religion played a vital part in the development of civilized life because it made possible the belief that there was more to life than mere animal existence. But the price of transcendence has been enslavement to the sacred. The Polish Marxist-turned-Christian philosopher Leszek Kolakowski acknowledges that religion is man's way of accepting life as inevitable defeat. To reject the sacred, he adds, is to reject our own limits. This is a tragic view that regards humans as inherently limited in knowledge, wisdom, and virtue, and demands that moral authority be alienated beyond the human sphere to God. The sacred protects humans from the flaws of their own nature. The sacred order, as Kolakowski observes, has never ceased, implicitly or explicitly, to proclaim, this is how things are, they cannot be otherwise. Now, in the 18th century, radical Enlightenment philosophers rejected both the idea of human limit and the need for the sacred. They recognized that social transformation was impossible so long as belief in the sacred placed certain institutions, practices, and beliefs beyond reason's gaze. They argued, too, that religious traditions were the cause, not the consequences, of human limitations. Only by breaking the constraints of the sacred could society and human beings themselves develop along rational lines. This was the utopian view of human nature and of social progress. What's interesting then is that if the opening exchanges of the God wars in the 18th century were driven by the assault of a tragic vision, the contemporary battlefield has been shaped largely by the failure of the utopian spirit. 2 centuries on, it is not just believers who view humans as fallen creatures and cleave to the tragic view. The evolutionary psychologist and atheist Steven Pinker, he says, the new sciences of human nature vindicate some version of the tragic vision and undermine the utopian outlook. What divides the two sides in today's God wars is not, as in the 18th century, the question of human limits, or whether moral authority should be alienated to beyond the human sphere, but how to characterize those limits and in who or what moral authority resides. Where believers look to God, atheists often turn to nature. We're not free to choose right and wrong, the philosopher Michael Roos suggests, because our moral ideas are thrust upon us by our function, as a function of our biology. Or as James Watson, co-discoverer of DNA, has put it, we used to think our fate was in our stars, now we know in large part that our fate is in our genes. And here we have the other F word that's at the heart of the God wars. Not faith, but fate. Enlightenment philosophers, to a large degree, rejected faith because they wanted to seize responsibility for human fate away from God's hands. So they can help, and I'm talking here about radical Enlightenment philosophy. There's a distinction that Jonathan Israel, the historian, makes very well between mainstream Enlightenment philosophy and radical Enlightenment philosophy. I'm talking here largely about what Israel would call the radical Enlightenment philosophers. For them, meaning and dignity derive not from the acceptance of fate, but from our capacity to defy it. Today, skepticism about our ability to shape the future for better leads many atheists to reject faith and yet accept the idea of human fate, with nature rather than God pulling the strings. I want to finish this talk with Albert Camus' meditation on faith and fate in The Myth of Sisyphus. Written in the embers of the Second World War, Camus confronts the tragedy of recent history and what he sees as the absurdity of the human condition. There is, he observes, a chasm between the human need for meaning and the unreasonable silence of the world. Religion is a means of bridging that chasm, but in his eyes, a dishonest one. So is the positivistic insistence that science can replace faith. I don't know if the world has any meaning that transcends it, he writes. But I do know that I do not know what this meaning is, and that it is impossible for me just to know it. Camus does not know that God does not exist, but he's determined to believe it, because that is the only way to make sense of being human. Humans have to make their own meaning, and that meaning can only come through struggle, even if that struggle appears as meaningless as that of Sisyphus, who, having scorned the gods, was condemned by them to spend eternity in the underworld, forever rolling a rock to the top of a mountain. The certainties of both God and scientific positivism, seems to me, provide false hope, and in so undermine our humanity by denying human choice. For Camus, religious faith must be replaced not with faithlessness, but with a different kind of faith. Faith in our ability to live with the predicament of being human. And in so doing, Camus made fate a matter of human action, not of divine intervention or of natural cause. It seems to me that was a very courageous argument, especially in the shadow of the Holocaust. It was also a challenge to both sides of the God wars. And it seems to me a challenge that remains as important today